and welcome to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast. I'm Roland, this is Matt, and we are busy going through wisdom in the Old Testament. We just finished the book of Proverbs, and so now we're heading over to the much easier book of Ecclesiastes.
Much easier, sure.
Much easier, yeah. Much more simple, much more straightforward.
Totally.
Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes.
Let me tell you a story about Ecclesiastes. So, I got really fascinated by this book in 2009.
I was in grade 10.
You were in grade... I was in my gap year. I was in London, and the guy who had been helping me out, read the Bible more and, really get into Bible handling and so on, Andrew Satch, he was doing a sermon series on Ecclesiastes. And I remember the first sermon, the first sermon in the series, he was like, I have no idea what this book is about.
That's right.
But I know that this
word... inspire confidence in your congregation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but as soon as he said that, of course, my interest was piqued. I was like, what is this book? That the guy who's taught me how to read the Bible is like happy to say, I have no idea what's going on.
That's fantastic.
And I remember in the first sermon, he was basically like, which is going to be the topic of this first episode, is like, I don't know what's going on, but I know this word Hevel is really important. And so let's just talk about Hevel for the next while, and then then that's what we did.
Yeah.
How have you come across Ecclesiastes?
Well, the first memory I've got of Ecclesiastes is I just got a new Bible, and I was with this new Bible, I was excited to read it, and I just kind of went through the contents pages like, Ecclesiastes, I've never read that one before. Let me just read it. And I read through thinking, this is really thought-provoking. What the heck is going on here? And then I finished the book, moved on to something else, and forgot about it.
Yeah.
And didn't think about it again for quite some time. And then on a youth camp one year, there was one of the talks I was given. There was the main series, which was on something else. I forget what now. But then there was a smaller series where one of the other speakers got up and did like a single talk on the whole of Ecclesiastes, a single talk on the whole of Esther, and a single talk on the whole of, I forget what the other book was. And he brought along this spray bottle. And at each point along the way, at a bunch of points along the way, he was like, and it's vapor, mist. And I forget everything else that he said in that talk,
but that stuck with me.
That left an impression. And then, I guess more recently, thinking I was busy in my honors year at college. I was doing my honors on Proverbs. And I was sitting with my supervisor talking about the future, talking about PhD and the fact that I'm thinking in that direction and thinking about what my topic would be, where I'd want to focus. And he was like, are you sure you just want to do Proverbs? Like, don't you want to branch out a little bit? And I kind of thought, well, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Where would I want to branch out? Ecclesiastes seems like a
it's not too far.
Fit.
Still in this category that we've been dealing with.
Yeah, so I could sort of branch out from being a Proverbs guy to being a wisdom guy. That might be a good way to go. So I started checking it out. We'd already had some conversations by that point on Ecclesiastes. I sort of knew that this was a book that you were really fascinated by. But I kind of I'd read it and thought, yeah, no, I can see that. I'm going to stick with Proverbs for now. And just as I started working through it, I started reading George Athas's commentary on it and getting a bit of a sense of what's going on in this book and thinking, okay, wow, here we go. This is a lot more interesting than I'd expected. Maybe that was just a timing thing, but this is really grabbing my attention now. And I think this is gonna prove to be quite the mind bender. I think what's interesting about Ecclesiastes, with Proverbs, you'd obviously read Proverbs and you checked out some of Proverbs, but not to the same degree. I've done an honors thesis. I'm busy with a PhD in Proverbs. That's a bit of a funny point. Having thought maybe I'm going to include Ecclesiastes in my PhD dissertation, then it worked out that I didn't have space and I'm just doing Proverbs. I'm just going to be the Proverbs guy. But with Ecclesiastes, I've actually done quite a bit of work leading up to that. I've actually done quite a bit of work in Ecclesiastes. So this is going to be quite an interesting conversation, or interesting set of conversations that actually both of us have checked this book out. I think you a lot more than I have.
But also from a less technical standpoint, I've just like studied it a lot, but I haven't gone as much into the literature or to the Hebrew as you have. So it's...
I think there's something to be said for time spent, though.
Sure.
But what's interesting is that we've both checked this book out independently of each other and come to, I think, some slightly different conclusions on some things. It's going to be interesting to see how some of that comes out in our conversations.
But that's actually worth pointing out. I think one of the things that makes Ecclesiastes such a scary book, I guess, or a tricky book to engage with is not only is it difficult for, on your first reading to understand what's going on, but like the scholarship itself is indicative of like not really knowing what to do with it. Like, I mean, in a lot of books, if I think of Leviticus, right, people can agree, the scholars agree generally about, like, there's some pretty big points that they agree on about Leviticus. Maybe they disagree on how it's structured or the exact, like, emphases that are being placed on certain parts of it. Like, is the Day of Atonement central, or is this other thing central, or whatever. But, like, in general, there's, like, high-level agreement on, like, the broad theology, the broad points that are hit. In Ecclesiastes, it's just, like, no agreement whatsoever. You'll find people who can't even agree whether the main voice in the book, Qoheleth, the teacher or the preacher, can't even agree whether he's orthodox or not. Like, some people, a non-negligible amount of people think that, like, he's actually just being put forward as a sort of an example of how not to do wisdom. As like a cautionary tale.
Not to think.
Which is just like mind-boggling, right? Like the amount of the level of disagreement is just insane. Although I will say, I think one thing that I think you find a lot of agreement on is that people struggle to think of it in terms of a well-structured book.
Sure.
Which I'm going to challenge. In not this episode, not the next episode, but the episode after that, I'll put forward my proposal of how I think we should think about the structure of Ecclesiastes. But yeah, it's wild how you never know what people are going to say. They can't agree. Is it a philosophical work? Is it a political commentary? Is it a bit of both?
No, absolutely. What everybody does seem to agree on is that Hevel is really important. What is Hevel?
And it's worth, so why do they agree on that? Well, the book starts with the word Hevel. So it's this word, depending on the translation you're reading, you'll get a different word. So if you're reading in the ESV, it says vanity of vanities in 1 verse 2. Everything, all is vanity, right? If you read in the NIV, it'll say meaningless, everything is meaningless. If you read in the NET, it'll be like futile, everything is futile.
How does it go with futile? That's interesting.
Well, the NET is interesting. Well, we'll get into that because it's got a different philosophy to how to translate the word.
Sure.
The book also ends on those very words. So after the teacher or the preacher or Qoheleth is finished talking, he ends on those very same words. So that's presumably why. At least in the beginning, if it's your opening and your closing thought, it's got to be an important piece to understand in terms of like what's going on. The challenge, of course, is that there's a lot of discussion on how to translate it. So there's not much discussion on its literal meaning. Like, we know what it literally means. It's used throughout the Bible. Although I think you pointed out to me that half the usages of it in the Old Testament are in Ecclesiastes or something like that.
Yeah.
That's like wild.
Close to half, yeah.
I guess you get... you artificially increase your word count when you just like doubling it up in the beginning and the end of your book. But
sure, yeah. So you've got Hevel says the teacher, Hevel, everything is Hevel. You got 5 just right
at the beginning,
and then a similar sort of thing toward the end.
So that's the word. Then the Hebrew word is Hevel.
Yeah,
and it means literally something like vapor, breath, or mist.
Like the my youth leader spray bottle.
Like a youth leader spray bottle, which is why your youth leader was doing that, right?
Yeah.
It's like you spray the thing, you could see it there, and but then it disappears very quickly.
A lot of the rest of his talk disappeared very quickly from my mind.
From your mind.
But
so that's the literal meaning. But then the question becomes, okay, given that that's the literal meaning, how does the the preacher, the teacher, Qoheleth, use it throughout the book to sort of, what's he drawing attention to in reality?
Yeah.
And how is he using that metaphor, that image, to draw attention to it? Because the word isn't, presumably we can't just assume that the word is completely disconnected from, the usage is completely disconnected from its literal sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, he's clearly using it in a semi-technical way. And so then it's like, we need to figure out what's going on there.
Yeah.
We should probably come to an agreement with what we're going to call him. So his name is Qoheleth, or the title given to him is Qoheleth. That's also the book's name in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
But then our different translations will translate that differently. So I see here the ESV calls it preacher. Are you looking at the NIV here?
This is the CSB says teacher. The NIV also says teacher. Yeah. So the Hebrew word Qoheleth. So I should write this one. You've got the Hebrew word there. You don't actually have to be able to read Hebrew for this part, don't worry. You can just trust me on this. If you can't read Hebrew, that says Qoheleth. Let's just put in the vowels for you. What we can say about the word Qoheleth, or the name Qoheleth, is that it comes from this Hebrew root.
Qoheleth?
Kahal.
Kahal, okay.
Which means to gather, to congregate, to bring together. When you bring an assembly together,
okay,
that's quite a. You see that in Deuteronomy. Moses brings together the assembly of God's people and addresses them. So that's what we've got. We've got the guy who assembles the people.
So he's like someone getting up on a stage or a soapbox, and
yeah, maybe that's the way we could think about him. So I like just calling him Qoheleth, just because we don't really have much of a preacher or teacher doesn't, like, you can see how you can get to preacher or teacher from somebody who gathers the assembly.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily think that's it's not like a direct line from Qoheleth to preacher or teacher. It sort of takes an extra step in between. There's one recent commentator, he just calls him Congregationalist. Not the Congregationalist, he just capital C, Congregationalist.
Interesting.
But he sort of does this with the books that he writes commentaries on.
Okay.
I haven't read it myself, but I seem to think his recent Genesis commentary as well. He doesn't call Eve. He calls, like, just transliterates the Hebrew.
Okay.
And like calls it Chava or whatever. That's just a thing he does. But anyway, my vote would be to just go with Qoheleth.
Okay. And I'll probably mispronounce him. I always say Qoheleth. Oh, I not always, but I switch. I get confused.
Quite often.
Yeah. But I will try my best to say his name correctly. Okay, so we're going to call him Qoheleth. It's best, we're going to talk about the translation of the word Hevel now. But I think at the end of the day, we're just going to use the word Hevel.
Yeah.
Because I think really the best thing you can do when it comes to any sort of treatise like you have here, even in the form of it, is especially when you can see that the author is trying to move beyond like a limiting meaning of something to try and make a point.
Yeah.
You want to let his discourse kind of define the word itself, the way that he uses it throughout. And so you kind of say, okay, I'm going to give it the label Hevel, and I'm going to have like a vague sense of what that means. And then it's going to get a more precise sense the more I engage with the way that he uses the word.
Yeah.
We actually get this in this is a common thing. So, Aristotle, for instance, when he introduces his form matter distinction, there's no there's no Greek word for matter in the way that we have it today, where it's just this like underlying all physical stuff, right? That's in Greek, there's no word like that. So he had to use another word. He used the word for wood, right? And it was like, that's wood is malleable. You can turn it into a bed. You can turn it into a shelf or whatever. And so it kind of has the same vibe.
Push the limits of that meaning, of that word's meaning. Yeah,
but when he says like, you and me are made out of form and matter, he doesn't for a second think that we're made out of wood. Yeah. He's clearly trying to go beyond that to get his point.
Yeah.
And so now it's, when we translate it these days, we translate it as matter or underlying thing or something to kind of get at the. And I think we should treat Hevel in the same way, where we recognize the connection it has to the metaphor that he's trying to use, but then, as far as possible, let him define it in his own usage of it.
Yeah.
That said, it can be useful to discuss some of the translations that have come up, and why they may be more or less helpful in the way that we deal with it.
Yeah, in the same sense that, we don't just, when reading Aristotle, we don't just translate it. We don't just use the Greek word for wood and just leave it as is. Like, we do need to have some idea of what meaning he attached to it. And so we want to go on the same quest to see what meaning Qoheleth attached to the word Hevel.
Right. So let's dig into that. So what does Hevel mean? Well,
he didn't exactly come in with a blank slate. So Hevel, I mean, like you mentioned a moment ago, Qoheleth isn't the first one to use Hevel in the Hebrew Bible. It does have a fair number of usages before Ecclesiastes came along. Pretty much every time it's used metaphorically.
Okay.
But to talk about something being insubstantial, talk about something being maybe transitory or fleeting or transient. How does that?
That's like your breath. You can say, like, you could think of that. I mean, those are very well connected to the idea of breath or mist, right? Like when you spray the water bottle and you see the droplets, they disappear within seconds. Or you think of the vapor that comes out of in the air after you've showered or something, right? And then it disappears almost as quickly as it appeared. And or the breath that you have, like on a cold day when you can see your breath, like it disappears very quickly. Like you can see how that is a very intuitive way of thinking about it. It's there. I think there's a weirdness in it, right? Because it's like, it's there, it's got some kind of body, but then it disappears so quickly that it's like, well, what was it? It's not like a rock that stays there.
Yeah.
So you say it's often used in a metaphorical sense too.
Pretty much always used in a metaphorical sense. But usually with insubstantial or transient as your sort of main meanings throughout the Hebrew Bible.
Okay. Yeah, the tricky thing with that, if we just took that specifically, is that it doesn't necessarily it doesn't work in all the cases it uses it in Ecclesiastes. Like we couldn't just say he's saying transient, everything is transient.
Yeah, I mean, Fredericks tries to do that.
Yeah?
I think, might even have been his PhD. His book is called Coping with Transients. He brings it into his commentary on Ecclesiastes that he tries to make the case that, yes, transient, everything is transient is exactly what we should say.
Okay.
Qoheleth is saying.
Right, okay, so what do we think about the word transient? I read, let's just go through some of them and see what the problem with them is.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the word transient? I mean, I think we should recognize there are some aspects where it fits fairly neatly, right? Like he wants to talk about the fact that you're going to die and be forgotten. And so in some sense, your life is transient. We see a similar idea in the New Testament where it talks about like men are like flowers that fade and die forever or something like that.
In Ecclesiastes 6 verse 12, indeed, who knows what good there is for humanity in life except to count the days of their transient life, maybe. Their Hevel life. And their actions like a shadow. When who can tell humanity what the end will be for humanity under the sun? You can sort of see counting days compared with a shadow, which is also quite often used as a metaphor for something fleeting in the Old Testament, the way that those things are associated. Sure, there's an intuitiveness about that. I don't know that it works so well for some other places, like maybe chapter 8. This too is Hevel, that there isn't a sentence made quickly for evil deeds, so people's hearts are set on doing evil, because one who sins does what is evil 100 times, and yet his life is prolonged, though still I know that it should go well for those who fear God, simply because they fear him. I don't know, there seems to be a bit of a tension there. I guess there might be a way that you could explain it, but the fact that he says, this is transient, that the wicked live long.
Yeah, there's a similar thing in 7 verse 15. He says, in my Hevel-filled life, I have seen everything, there's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing.
Yeah.
If he had ended with just the righteous man perishing in his righteousness, you could be like, cool, I can see how that's pointing transience, and righteousness can't help you escape that.
Yeah.
But that's not his point. His point is that despite his righteousness, he perishes. And despite the wickedness of the wicked man, he prolongs his life, which is the opposite of transience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not a great fit for transient.
Not a great fit. So we raised two common ones in so the ESV is vanity. It's connected to futility as well. Vain is a weird word. I mean, we don't use it that very often, but I think it's when you say I do something in vain.
Yeah. Rather than somebody being vain, they think too much of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea of doing something in vain, what does that kind of connote? It's like doing something and it wasn't worth it in the end.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of effort in something and then it turns out to be for nothing.
Yeah, it's not too far off from insubstantial. It's coming at it from a slightly different angle, but something that doesn't amount to much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the product of your work that's insubstantial rather than like your life or something that's insubstantial.
Yeah, so insubstantial would be that the result didn't amount to much, whereas something vain, the effort that you put in didn't serve a great purpose.
Right. Okay, so that's one. And that's kind of connected to futile. It's futile to pursue these things because they won't end up in anything. What do you think about that?
Again, I'm not sure that it gels very well with what we saw in chapter 7 and 8. Maybe I'm just short-circuiting here, but...
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, if we say... He's kind of pointing to a puzzle in 7, right? He's saying, like, there's... it doesn't happen to the righteous as it should, and it doesn't happen to the wicked as it should. But where's the vanity in that?
Right.
Like, I mean, if anything, the wicked person's life there is not vain, because he's prolonging it. Maybe you could say it's, again, if it was just the righteousness aspect of it, if he was just saying, oh, it's, the righteous person perishes in his righteousness, you could say, oh, that was a vain pursuit.
Right. Yeah.
But when he then also, in the same breath, he...
well played.
Thank you. He says, like, and the wicked prolong, it's like, okay, no, he's not highlighting vanity there. He's highlighting something else, but it's difficult to say what exactly that is.
Yeah.
Do you have any other passages that you can think of off the top of your head?
I don't think so. I mean, for vanity, one that does seem to work well is chapter 2, when he's talking about his all his achievements, and then kind of coming to the end of that and saying, well, that didn't seem to go very far. But but I think that's probably the best that you can do with vanity.
Yeah, would this one connect with vanity? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is Hevel and the striving after wind.
I don't know that I'd want to connect that with vanity. Maybe you could. The way that verse is often understood is that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush sort of thing.
Yeah.
That take what you've got rather than exert yourself for something that you don't have, because you might well find that what you don't have, you'll never have.
Yeah.
Enjoy what you have while you have it. So better to enjoy those things than to go after these vain pursuits. Could see how maybe it could work there.
But there I think you're highlighting one aspect of it. Right. So what's Hevel is not the pursuit of the wandering of the eyes. What's Hevel is that it's better to have what you have than to pursue something with your eyes, with your desire. Which is, like, the whole thing is Hevel, not just this or that part of it, And so vanity is in there somewhere, but not necessarily the exact thing he's trying to draw attention to.
Yeah. The other thing to consider is sort of touched on a moment ago, the difference between vanity and insubstantial. If vanity has to do with the effort and insubstantial to do with the product, I think insubstantial actually would work better for, say, 5 verse 6 or verse 7. The Hebrew and the English are a little bit different. Only in chapter 5, fortunately.
Yeah.
But
I don't know why that happened.
Yeah.
Well, let's go with the English ones, because that's where people are going to be looking in their Bibles.
So I think then verse 7. But it could also be verse 5. I'm not really sure. I'm looking at a translation that's come directly from the Hebrew. But on account of many dreams, hevels, and many words. Like that. Let's maybe get that in context.
Oh, that's 5 verse 7. For when dreams increase and words grow many, there's Hevel. But God is the one you must fear. He's talking about the case where you make a vow to God, and he's saying, do not delay in paying it.
Yeah.
Why would you, speak a bunch and like make these grand promises and then like only to end up making God angry at you by not like fulfilling them?
Why should God be angry because of your voice and ruin the deeds of your hands on account of many dreams, hevels, and many words? So fear God. It seems to be that what he's talking about there, it seems more like the thing rather than the effort towards the thing to me. Just as the words are what come out of your mouth, the mists there would be potentially the result of your effort. So in that sense, it would be something insubstantial rather than something vain. That's sort of what makes more sense to me as I read this verse.
Okay, so we're not happy with that either. We're not too happy with transience. We're not too happy with vanity and futility. They're getting at something. They're right. They're definitely fit some cases. Other cases, not so much.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the NET has an approach to this, which is different to many of the other ones, many of the other translations, where they don't have a single translation for the word.
Oh, interesting.
So they'll give different translations throughout the book, depending on what they consider to be the weight of the usage.
Right.
In some senses, in some ways, that's a good way to go. Like you're highlighting what you think the significance of it is. In another way, you're kind of obscuring the argument of Qoheleth, right? Because he's using one word for all of these things. He clearly sees a unified phenomenon underlying all of these different usages. But you're using these completely different words in different contexts, and it's like, well, you're missing the thing that he's trying to get across to you.
Yeah.
So it's helpful in one sense. I think it's definitely helpful if it's just a book you need to read as part of your Bible reading plan. You're not going to like really sit down and think about it as hard as you can.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get at exactly what Qoheleth is getting at, I don't know if I'm a huge fan of that approach.
It sort of undercuts when he says that everything is Hevel.
Right.
It seems to undercut that a bit.
Yeah. Because it's like everything is... Because it's quantifying of everything and saying it's this one thing.
Yeah.
But what you're doing when you translated these different words, you're like, well, some things are this, some things are this, some things are this. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the last one that I'm familiar with that is the NIV is it says meaningless or absurd. Those are like the two...
Yeah, so meaningless and absurd might fit together in that they both sound like they come from existentialism. Absurd is quite famously argued for by Michael Fox. But meaningless is probably one of the more well-known ones. It's in the NIV, the NLT. Tramper Longman's a big proponent of meaningless. What do you think?
Well, I'm not a huge fan of them precisely because of the existentialist baggage.
Right.
We have given meaning to these two ideas, and the existentialist sort of outlook on life, project, its relation to ethics, is just, I don't want to say it's brand new, but it's very individualistic, somewhat, it's not always secular, but like, somewhat secular. I remember when I was growing up and thinking, I thought asking the question, what's the meaning of life, was just this perennial question that philosophers have been grappling with since the beginning. But they haven't. Like, you don't find it in Aristotle, you don't find it in Aquinas, you don't find it in Augustine. Like, that's not the categories that they're working in. It's a term that arose to an extent out of a rejection of ethics and of notions like purpose and morality and so on for the individual.
Yeah.
And so it seems weird to me to read this baggage that we have back into someone who was even before Aristotle, or around the same time as Aristotle, in a different world setting. So at the outset, I would prefer to find a word that captures what you're trying to get across with words like absurd and meaningless without any of the existentialist baggage that comes with it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's also very difficult to connect something like absurd with mist.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we've kind of moved
absurd
beyond the metaphor a bit too far at that point. Yeah.
In what sense is mist meaningless? I mean, you can sort of get there by taking a few steps. So something is mist. Something might be insubstantial in that mist might be insubstantial in that it lacks substance, which you can sort of extend to it lacks meaning in that it lacks a sort of
full clear content.
Substance.
Yeah.
But because you have to take that extra step, to me that seems like a step away, an extra step away from the root phenomena that you're deriving this from.
Yeah, even the idea of absurd, like the mist itself isn't absurd. Like you're absurd, if anything. You're the one who's absurd for trying to contain the mist or something. Right.
Yeah.
But that's not. Qoheleth isn't saying necessarily. Sometimes he is, but he's not necessarily saying like you're absurd. He's saying like reality is Hevel. Hevel is in reality, and that impacts our thing. So we're not quite getting at what he's getting at when we draw attention to that.
Yeah. And then if we were to sort of reverse engineer that, if somebody was looking for a metaphor or something was looking out to the world to try and find something to explain meaningless, it just isn't clear to me that mist would be the thing that you'd go to.
No.
Surely perhaps it's difficult to understand.
Yeah.
But we've got better words for that, like enigmatic.
Enigmatic. I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Illusion, elusive, obscure.
Yeah.
Meaningless just doesn't seem to be the natural one the kind of natural correspondent.
Yeah.
That seems like a strange way of saying it.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you were looking to mist, then surely something like enigmatic would be a better fit if those were the sorts of connotations you were trying to draw out.
Okay, so those are the main ones on offer. I think you and I actually arrived at fairly similar.
Again, quite independently of each other.
Yeah. So when I the sixth time I was looking at this book, I think the word that arose to me it's good in the sense that I think it captures really well what Qoheleth is trying to get at. It's bad in the sense that it's not a very common word that people use. So the word I like is intractable, intractability. We use this a lot in maths and computer science, talk about problems that are difficult to get a handle on, or we can't come up with a practical solution for, or that we can't make a computer run in a reasonable amount of time to solve, kind of thing. And so the problem is intractable. We can't we can't gain traction on it. That's the main sense of it. We can't grasp at it, whether it be intellectually or take hold of it. And so that's the word I gravitate towards when I think about Hevel.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you pick, and I've tested this with people, if you pick 10 people and you say, what does the word intractable mean? Maybe one of them is going to be able to tell you, give you a sense vaguely within the ballpark.
That was our experience when you introduced the idea to me. You're like, I think intractable. It's like, okay, cool.
What does that mean?
What's intractable?
So it's not super helpful in the sense that it's not great to explain one obscure word with another obscure word.
Right.
Although the one advantage is that you can type the word intractable into your Oxford English Dictionary app, and it'll give you a definition, whereas you can't do that with Hevel.
Right. Yeah. So not far removed from that, I've preferred ungraspable or elusive.
Elusive, yeah.
So I particularly like elusive, but that notion of ungraspability is sort of what I think fits quite well with what Qoheleth's trying to do. That it's something that you can't get a handle on in the first place, or if you can, it still slips through your fingers.
Yeah.
So you can't keep a grasp on it.
I really like that idea of that you highlight. I never really thought of it like that, but it's like if you blew the air out right when it's cold, and it's like, okay, now there's this ball in the air in front of you, and then you try to try to hold it like you would hold a tennis ball or a basketball or something,
Yeah.
then like your hands go right through it.
Yeah.
And like that's exactly the sort of thing. It's like it appears to be something, but as soon as you try to go for it and like take it and contain it somehow, it's not there. It disappears as you get close to it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's a really cool, and that fits. I think he's going for something. He's pursuing something, and he's getting frustrated because like no matter how he tries to get at it, whenever he gets close enough, it doesn't seem to be there anymore. And he's like, what the heck is going on here? Like, it's so irritating.
So there's a great quote from Stuart Weeks. He doesn't actually go with elusive. He goes with illusion.
Elusive, not elusive.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he attaches some other connotations to that, which we'll leave aside for the moment. But he's got this great quote that I think really gets at Qoheleth's enterprise and really does well to recommend elusive as what Hevel might mean. What we want, we cannot get, and all that we achieve is ours only in passing. When we leave the world, we go as we came, and all our work slip between our fingers, as though we were grasping at air. I just think that really hits the nail on the head.
That's good, yeah. And that I think that what's interesting is that you can see where the nice thing about that approach is that it explains why sometimes transient works, and other times vain works, but neither of them works like for all the cases.
Yeah.
Because there's not necessarily either of those, even though that those sometimes might be the consequence or the result that comes from this elusiveness or this ungraspability, unhandleability. No, that's not great. Intractability.
Yeah.
So that's our recommendation.
Yeah.
Is intractability, elusiveness, ungraspability. So I think before we close, although we probably should close this episode, is a question of, well, what's the name we give then to the thing that he's trying to grasp? Because he doesn't give a word to it.
Yeah.
He kind of gives, you can infer what he's trying to go for based on his recounting of his failed attempts, right? But he never really gives a word to it. He's happy to give a word to Hevel and then move on.
In one sense, he does.
Oh yeah.
So in 1 verse 3, what profit is there for anyone in all the labors at which they labor under the sun? So in some sense, profit is the thing that he's getting at. But profit, I think, in our minds has a bit more of a narrower connotation to it. It's got like a very, very much a business sort of context. With a business set of connotations that,
like a physical thing that you could gain, like wealth or prosperity or something. Yeah,
which might be some of what Qoheleth's talking about.
Yeah,
but it certainly seems to go beyond that. So as a starting point, it sort of gestures towards what Qoheleth might be going for. But I think we need a broader catch-all term for what he's after. Yeah,
the thing that strikes me is in 1 verse 13, he says, he uses two other descriptions. He says, I searched out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, and then it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 3, he says that again. He says, I've seen the busyness that God has given man to be busy with. Which is like very general, right? It's like, what are we supposed to be doing here? Right? Like kind of like purpose or something. Like he's definitely got some people, I've heard people talk about or wonder whether Qoheleth is like taking a secular outlook on things. But I mean, I don't think you can say that. Like from the beginning, he's very clear that God is in control, and he's even when he's very unhappy, he's like, well, this is what God has given to us to deal with. So yeah, but that's a very broad outlook. Like, what are we supposed to be doing here? Which I could kind of see why people go for the meaningless aspect there, because it's like people ask that question, like, what's the meaning of life?
Yeah. Problem is, we ask that question.
We ask that question, exactly. That's a very modern question. So yeah, I think both you and I are happy to talk about happiness as the goal.
Yeah.
Largely because I think we've been influenced by the Greek philosophers. And this is just a word that they gave to this very thing. It's like, what are humans supposed to be doing? Like, what is the thing we're supposed to be doing that is like the fulfillment of our life as humans? Now, they obviously thought about that in a different way. They didn't have this notion of God in the way that the Hebrews did. So we don't want to, muddy the waters too much. But I think happiness as a word for that is a pretty good one, as long as we understand that it's more of a question than it is an answer. So
yeah. And it's not as simple as just kind of keep a smile on your face.
Yes.
Like happiness is taken a bit more technical meaning there.
Yeah, happiness is that thing that we should pursue, that we are seeking to understand. Like we're seeking to figure out what that is exactly.
Yeah.
So if you think of Aristotle, he's like, happiness is that which we desire for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. And he's like, and then he goes on to say, well, is that wealth? Is that honor? Is that pleasure? Is that this or that or whatever? And so I think if we think of Qoheleth doing the same thing, where he's like, I'm trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing here. So we could say, okay, I'm looking for what happiness is, but I don't know how we're supposed to grasp it.
Yeah.
It seems ungraspable. It's really irritating. Then I think we're in the sort of the right mindset to understand what's coming next.
Yeah.
So let's end it there. So thanks for joining us for this first episode in Ecclesiastes. Please join us for the future episodes where we continue through this journey that Qoheleth is taking us on.
We can assure you it won't be a vain pursuit.
It won't be what are the things they have to do?
Like and subscribe. Subscribe wherever you want to listen to podcasts, or on YouTube if you're watching the video.
Give us a rating.
Give us a rating. A good rating, if that suits you.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, maybe don't leave us the rating. It would help others to find this podcast. And thanks for joining us.